The Dust Bowl. Just hearing that name, right? It conjures up these powerful images of giant dust storms and families piling into old cars fleeing west. It's a foundational story of American hardship. But what if the story we all think we know isn't quite right?
And let's be honest, no one has shaped that story more than John Steinbeck. His incredible novel, The Grapes of Wrath, gave a face, a name, and a voice to all that suffering. It's this powerful, unforgettable narrative that has really defined how we've understood this era for generations.
But what if there's a completely different version of this story? One that isn't told through beautiful prose, but through cold, hard numbers. A story that's actually been hiding in plain sight for decades, buried deep inside old census records. So to really get what the data is telling us, we first have to be crystal clear on the myth that it's challenging. And that myth, for all intents and purposes, is the story of the Joad family. Yep, this is the narrative we all know. A family of farmers, totally ruined by dust and the Great Depression, joins this mass exodus to California only to find even more hardship. It's a powerful story of victimhood, and it's basically become the shorthand for the entire Dust Bowl migration. But what if that whole narrative has some major holes in it? See, recently, a new source of information has given us a completely different lens to look through. And it's not a novel, it's an economic research paper. So instead of following a fictional family, these researchers acted like historical detectives. They painstakingly tracked thousands of real men who lived in the absolute hardest hit Dust Bowl counties. They followed them from the 1920 census right through the 1930s and into the 1940 census. This lets us see for the very first time what really happened to the people of the plains. Okay, so the first and most fundamental part of the myth is this idea of a mass exodus, that the Dust Bowl counties just emptied out because everyone fled. Well, the data tells a different, and frankly, a much more surprising story. Now, at first glance, the numbers seem to back up the myth. The population in these counties did drop by a pretty significant 20%. So, open and shut case, right? Well, the crucial question isn't that the population fell, but why. And this, right here, is where the story gets really, really interesting. The research found that the main driver of that population drop wasn't a flood of people leaving. It was that the river of people who were supposed to be arriving simply dried up. Think about it like this. In the 1920s, the Southern Plains were booming. People were flocking there. The in-migration rate was almost 50%. But in the 1930s, that flow just stopped, dead in its tracks. In fact, the population would have actually grown if people had just kept arriving at the same rate. So the real story isn't an exodus, it's a closed door. Okay, so if the story isn't really about a massive exodus, what about the people who did leave? The myth tells us they were all farmers, just like the Joads, who had lost everything. Let's see what the data says about that. This chart shows one of the most stunning findings in the whole paper. When you look at who was most likely to leave, farmers are at the very, very bottom of the list. The people most likely to migrate were actually non-farm workers. It's the exact opposite of what we've been told. I mean, this quote from the paper really drives the point home. Not only were farmers the least likely to move, but this was a pattern that was unique to the Dust Bowl. In other parts of the country, farmers moved at about the same rate as everyone else. But in the Dust Bowl, they stayed put. This just completely contradicts that central image of the Joads. So why on earth did they stay? Well, the answer is pretty simple economics. Farmers owned land, they owned equipment, and they had knowledge that was specific to that place. A farmer couldn't just pack up his farm and take it with him, Leaving meant abandoning his entire life's work and capital. Non-farm workers, on the other hand, well, their skills were a lot more portable. All right, now for the third big myth, that the journey west was a road to ruin, that it just ended in poverty and exploitation out in California. The data tells a very, very different story. First off, these heat maps do confirm one part of the popular story. On the left, you can see migration patterns in the 1920s. Now look at the right. During the 1930s Dust Bowl, you see that bright red spot over California? It gets way more intense. So yeah, people were absolutely heading west. But the key question is, what happened when they got there? The story of the Joads is one of downward mobility, right? Of proud farmers becoming desperate laborers. But when you track the real-life migrants, a very different picture starts to emerge. Check out this table. It shows what happened to the farmers who did leave.
Now, while some did become laborers, just like the myth suggests, a much larger group, nearly 40%, moved into semi-skilled or even high-skilled work. They were actually more likely to move up the occupational ladder than down.
And here is the real punchline. On average, the farmers who left the Dust Bowl ended up in occupations that paid 9.5% more than the farmers who stayed behind. For many of them, migration wasn't an act of desperation. It was a successful economic calculation. Now, it's really crucial to add some nuance here. This was not a golden ticket for everyone. Non-farmers who left, they actually saw their earnings decline on average. And the data only gives us a snapshot in 1940. It doesn't mean migrants didn't face terrible hardship in the years it took to get established. The reality was complicated. So when we put all these pieces together, what does the story of the Dust Bowl look like? It's definitely not the simple, tragic myth that we've all inherited. It's something far more complicated and, in many ways, way more interesting. So here's the final comparison. The myth tells us about a mass exodus of ruined farmers all fleeing to certain poverty. The data, the reality, reveals a halt in new arrivals, with farmers being the most anchored group, and a migration that, for many, was a calculated risk that actually paid off. And let's be super clear, none of this is to say the Dust Bowl wasn't a tragedy. It absolutely was. The suffering was immense. But what the data does is shift the narrative. It replaces the story of helpless victims with a more nuanced story of rational economic actors, of people making tough choices in impossible circumstances, and of incredible resilience in the face of disaster. And this really leaves us with a final, bigger question. The Grapes of Wrath is a powerful, essential piece of literature, but this research shows that sometimes the stories that feel the most true aren't the whole truth. It makes you wonder, what other parts of our history might look completely different if we took a moment to look at the math behind the myth?